Order or left to right? Let's stand.
Okay, excellent. Professor, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I don't know how many people saw today's Boston Globe, but one of the lead editorials is something called Progress by the Megabyte, which is, I attribute to the timeliness of the conversation and Northeastern's capacity to have these things timed just right. Paul asked as I came in if I wrote the editorial, and I did not, but I do commend it to your reading. It's funny, Nani referred to the Broadband czar role, and every time that comes up in the governor's presence, he will turn to me and he says, you know, things don't typically end well for the czars. So I have to keep that in mind, particularly if I'm out in Western Massachusetts. More than once, I have a newfound appreciation for why the Shays Rebellion started in Western Mass, and I know Paul does too. I will tell you a real funny story quickly. When I joined the administration in February of 2007, my first day on the job, I barely knew where the restroom was, barely knew how to make an outside call, and I got a phone call connected to me through the receptionist who was the chief of staff of a Western Mass legislator, a state senator, who wanted to know who was serving in the role of the Broadband czar. This was a position, as Nani said, it was created in 2006 by the legislature as part of their Economic Stimulus Act. It was vetoed by then Governor Romney, restored by the legislature. And, you know, this was my first day on the job. I knew I was wearing many hats, but I had no idea who this person was. And I said, but I'm going to find out, I promise. So no sooner had I hung up the phone than someone opened my door and came in and said, by the way, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. If anyone asks, you are, among other roles, serving as the Broadband czar. So the first thing I did was I pulled up the statute and read 3 pages of qualifications the legislature had written as to the attributes they wanted this individual to have, none of which I had. And then the second thing I had to do as Broadband czar in my official capacity was call this chief of staff and explain that this position that was so important that her boss had her call affirmatively to reach out and see who was sitting in that chair. That was me, and I didn't even know that I was serving in that role. So it was sort of a humbling beginning to this, and I think of myself as a relatively quick study, but certainly serving as the governor's point of broadband, one of the things I've done is try to leverage outside expertise. Someone who worked with Nani in our secretariat, someone named Sharon Gillette, who's now at the FCC, came in as our DTC commissioner. You may have overlapped with her at MIT. And so a lot of thought leadership in Massachusetts, and certainly was able to build upon work that had been done, particularly around demand aggregation in Western Mass. I know that the seminar format is really intended to tease out sort of opposing ideas and interests, but I hope that people don't walk away from my discussion today with a view that my view is that government's all good and that Verizon or private incumbents are all bad. As Paul or Jack, your colleague here, will tell you, you know, I know there's some advocates out there who espouse that view, but I'm not among them. And you will hear later from Paul, I'm sure, Verizon spends a staggering amount of money on broadband infrastructure at a level unmatched by anything that's contemplated by the state or the federal government. And I'm not aware of any state solution here or elsewhere that will succeed without private participation. But what I do hope that you will walk away from today is a better notion of what we call public or societal goods. And this is what I think really comes from broadband investment and why government needs to be engaged on this. It has a proven track record, broadband does, of stimulating economic growth, creating jobs, increasing property values and tax receipts. And a company like Verizon, you know, I worked as a corporate lawyer for many years. I represented companies like Verizon. You know, I don't think a company like Verizon is really well equipped to factor in a lot of these public goods into their bottom line. Doesn't mean that they don't think that they are public or societal goods, but these are companies that are, you know, are managing for their stockholders. They've got investment analysts that are measuring their performance on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. Doesn't mean that Verizon is a bad actor. It means that there are different interests at play. And in my experience, you know, the fact that Verizon is looking out for the interest of stockholders, trying to make a profit, it means that it's a thoughtful, well-managed company. And so I think that, you know, I suspect that there are going to be things we disagree on, but I certainly don't, you know, think of Verizon as a bad actor in this space. I do think that the government, both state and federal, has a role to play here, and I'll talk about that. And it's really around the investment horizon. Federal government, state government has a longer time horizon in order to make investments where We don't need to sort of show the immediate return, and these public societal goods, improved access to healthcare, education, helping disadvantaged populations, these are things that the government can do with your tax dollars in mind. So let's see, if you'll go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm just going to talk about, in I think 15 minutes, a few quick areas. Does equal access matter? What is the role of government, and what are we doing here in Massachusetts? So this, if you go to the next slide, this first statement is a statement that I think most people here would probably agree with, but the fact that that is a notion that's commonly accepted shows how much this policy argument has shifted over the last decade. How many people here have used the internet today? Just either check email, check website, stuff like that. So I suspect many people here view it as a pretty essential asset, that you would, if your internet service was cut off, you would experience almost in the same way you would if your water was cut off and you couldn't take a shower, or you couldn't use the toilet, or you couldn't, turn the light bulb. I mean,
that could be worse.
Yeah, it would be. I saw, yesterday was, I don't know if people know why it's called Cyber Monday. It's such a curious concept. It's the idea that people are going to their workplace where they have internet in order to do non-work, which is to shop on the internet. So they still refer to it as Cyber Monday. I've always thought that was a weird thing for companies to be promoting. Go to your office, and on your employer's time, go to Amazon. But it's extraordinary. 900 million in sales yesterday. I read that UPS has employed additional 50,000 people between now and the years just to address all the delivery issues. So this is real in commerce, and I think that it's a pretty fundamental infrastructure asset, and we'll talk about why. People, you may have heard the expression, politicians sort of campaign in poetry and they govern in prose. I want to read one statement that I saw in the National Broadband Plan. It was buried, it wasn't a highlighted statement, but I think it's a pretty apropos statement. It says, as a country, we believe that to march ahead, we don't need to leave anyone behind. We believe that all deserve the opportunity to improve their lives. We believe that where you start shouldn't dictate where you finish, that demography isn't destiny, that privilege isn't a necessary prologue to success. So this really segues to this notion of sort of equal opportunity. It's long guided our government's efforts to make access to technology universal, from electricity to telephone, from television to radio. And today, as technology continues to change the way the world interacts, to be on the outside, you referred, Richard, to the notion of the digital side. We still refer to that in Western Mass. To be on the outside is to live in a separate analog world, disconnected from the vast opportunities that broadband enables. I'm sure Paul will go into this. 95% of Americans have access to broadband, but that number really masks wide gulfs, particularly among certain demographic groups, including the poor, the elderly, some racial and ethnic minorities, those who live in rural areas, and those with disabilities. And broadband can really help bridge these gaps, whether it be through education. Similarly, people with broadband, people with disabilities can live more independently wherever they choose. They can telecommute. So I think people still need to work to benefit from access to broadband. But universal broadband and the skills to use it can undoubtedly lower barriers of means and distance to help achieve more equal opportunity. Let's go to the next slide. Just real quickly, I'm not going to go through all these, but I want to talk about how we stacked up as a nation and as a state. And there are lots of ways in which you can slice and dice the stats. And Paul and I may disagree on some of these, but these are taken from the FCC's National Broadband Plan. It was released this spring. For those of you who are interested in reading more about this as a topic matter, I think the FCC's National Broadband Plan is a really thoughtful piece, and it raises some really interesting questions, has lots of recommendations for the feds and for the states. So again, I won't run through all these, but these just give you sort of a sense of the numbers today. Jennifer, next slide, please. Also, in terms of some of the things that you can save by using broadband, whether it be through improved healthcare access, smart grid. We talk about the educational opportunities, things that people take for granted, perhaps. In terms of if you were here at Northeastern, a lot of schools don't have high-speed internet connections in this way. So let's go to the next slide. A couple of other stats. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, has ranked the U.S. 15th, down from 4th in 2000 among OECD nations in broadband penetration. For Massachusetts, about 74% of our population has broadband. That rank us about 8th. But as we'll talk about in Western Mass, the digital divide is real out there. And is there anyone here from Western Mass, Western Mass? You know, I grew up in Alabama, and it was hard for me to even imagine that there were areas in Massachusetts without broadband. I mean, this is such a knowledge, information-based economy that there are. Next slide. We'll talk about, you know, the average U.S. speed right now is 14 megabits per second. That's roughly half the typical speed in Hungary and Netherlands. To give you an example, in Japan right now, their connections offer of 1 gigabit a second. So that's fast enough to actually download a full-length movie in about 12 seconds. So now we'll talk about their reasons why this is the case. I mean, Japan, South Korea, these are not, you know, these are much more densely populated areas. They don't have a lot of the challenges. You know, we regulate on the state and the federal level. There are lots of reasons why this is the case, but you know, what we have here is, in many instances, for many communities, not equal to what is available overseas, and where what we have is oftentimes more expensive. So, next slide. You know, in Metro Paris right now, you can get unlimited phone, 150 television channels, and internet downloads at about 20 megabits. Which is about 30 euros, about $37. In the U.S., average broadband download speed, according to FCC, is 4 megabits per second. And in order that I don't pick on Verizon, I'll tell you that Comcast, which is the largest U.S. cable operator, charges at least $130 each month for unlimited domestic phone calls, more than 200 video channels, and speeds of 12 megabits a second in its home market of Philadelphia. So I believe that unless we really tackle these gaps, we're going to fail to seize the opportunity to improve our state and our nation, and we will fall behind those countries that do. Finally, we talked about equal access. Absent action, the individual and societal cost of this digital divide are going to grow. With so many Americans lacking broadband access or the skills to make it matter, the internet really does have the potential to actually exacerbate inequality. If learning online accelerates your education, if working online helps you earn more money, if searching for jobs online makes it more likely you're going to be able to get a job, then for those offline, the gap only widens. If political dialogue moves to online forums, if the internet becomes the comprehensive source of real-time news, if the easiest way to contact your political representatives is through email or a website, then those offline become increasingly disenfranchised. So until recently, not having broadband was an inconvenience, but I would argue that now broadband is really essential to both opportunity and citizenship. So let's go back one, please. So let's just talk about the role of government. In the 1850s, we connected America with the Transcontinental Railroad. As many of you may be aware, in the 1930s, there was a significant investment in the electrical grid, particularly around rural electrification. In the 1950s, we connected Americans to the interstate highway system. The private investment, to be clear, was pivotal in building most of these networks, but government action also played a very important role. Treasury bonds and land grants underwrote the railroad. The Rural Electrification Act, which was a New Deal program, brought electricity to homes, and including where I grew up, and the federal government funded 90% of the cost of the interstate highways. So the way I think about it is infrastructure networks really unite us as a country. It brings together parents and children, buyers and sellers and citizens of government in ways once unimaginable. And ubiquitous access to infrastructure networks has continually driven American innovation, progress, prosperity, and global leadership. So, segueing to communications infrastructure played an integral role in this American story. In the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, telephony, radio, television transformed America. It really did create a new foundation for job growth and international competitiveness. In communications, the government stimulated construction of radio and television facilities across the country, offering huge tracts of the public airways literally free of charge. It did the same with telephony through the Universal Service Fund. And broadband is really the great infrastructure challenge of the earliest 21st century. It is, high-speed internet is what is transforming the landscape of America right now. And it's actually doing it more pervasively and more quickly than earlier infrastructure networks. So like railroads and highways, broadband accelerates the velocity of commerce, reducing the cost of distance. Like electricity, it creates a platform for America to lead in developing better ways to solve old problems. And like telephony and broadcasting, it expands our ability to communicate, inform, and entertain. So I think that a thoughtful approach to the development of, just as a thoughtful approach to the development of electricity and telephone, radio, and television transformed America, I think that's the way that we are trying to approach broadband. So I think that we'll talk about, you'll see when we talk about the Western Mass Initiative, part of what we're trying to do is strike the balance between the public and private sectors. I think there's a role for the government, state and federal, to play in this, but I think that those of us in the public sector also must be pretty candid about where our current government policies hinder innovation and private investment in broadband. I think there are ways in which we can build on our strengths in innovation and inclusion, but we really do have to strike the right balance between the public and private sector. Done right, government policy can drive and has driven progress. In the 60s and 70s, government research supported the development of the technology which actually, on which the internet is based. In the 1990s, the FCC acted to ensure that telephone providers would not stall the use of the internet. An act of Congress actually stimulated competition that caused cable companies to upgrade their networks and for the first time offer broadband to many Americans. And auctions for public spectrum promoted competitive wireless markets that Richard talked about, prompting continual upgrades that first delivered mobile telephones and now mobile broadband. So, the United States is distinct from these international countries that we've referenced in many ways. I think we can learn from these international experiences while taking into account the distinguishing realities of broadband in the U.S. And so, I will, let's just go to the next slide and I'll very quickly touch upon what we're doing in Massachusetts and why. When Donald Patrick first was campaigning for governor in 2005 and 2006, there were several things I would argue that distinguished him as a candidate. One was that if elected, he was going to govern for the whole state. It was important to him that that every corner of the state was going to be open for business, not just Metro Boston. Second, it was very important to the governor, and remains so, that we govern for the long term, and we make investments that promote our knowledge economy. And so, in many respects, this is acknowledging what distinguishes Massachusetts from other states and building upon those strengths. So, the seeds of the governor's broadband initiative were really formed during that 2005-2006 campaign, when he was meeting with and listening to residents and businesses, particularly in Western Massachusetts. To just cut things short, we developed this initiative in consultation with other actors. The governor filed legislation in fall of '07. It was passed after many hearings through the legislature in summer of '08 and signed by the governor into law August of '08. And it created the Massachusetts Broadband Institute, which I will talk about in a sec. And in terms of the sort of the founding precepts of this, again, it's that the 100% private model has failed to achieve ubiquitous broadband in Western Mass. And again, there are a lot of people who will blame the incumbents for that. We did our own analysis, and the break-even timeline for a company like Verizon to invest in Western Mass, given the less densely populated area, is about 30 years. These are not communities that are economical in the strictest sense to serve. But these are the last areas in Massachusetts to get electricity, and they will be the last areas in Massachusetts to get broadband. And as with electricity, it's a public intervention to do that. So again, this is not, I'm not passing a moral judgment on Verizon or others. They're making astute business decisions about where they're going, where there are customers that are easily reached. And what we are trying to do is to sort of take out what's that CapEx and make it easier for private entrants, both incumbents, large and small, to come in and to work with the government to reach these customers. So, turn to the next slide, please. Just so that you were aware of some of the things that we were sort of struggling with, there's sort of 3 areas that we could have really focused on in terms of tools within our toolkit. One was regulation. I'm sure Verizon thinks that we don't miss an opportunity to regulate what we do, but broadband is typically an area that's free from state regulations, and I believe it should remain so to allow free market operation. We've worked around demand aggregation. Massachusetts has 350 odd towns, and one of the ways in which people thought about doing this was to try to create things like Berkshire Connect, Western Mass Connect, demand aggregation, but still the economics in many areas are just untenable to reach these communities. So we really did focus on this idea of reducing the capital needs and to try to reduce the break-even time frame and incent deployment. So next slide. So the MBI, or Mass Broadband Institute, was created in August of '08. The governor filed the legislation with $25 million. It came out of the legislature with $40 million. And when we were doing this, there literally was not any engagement, I would argue, on the federal side. What's been really nice about this is at the time we did this, I think there were maybe 10 states that had a designated state agency responsible for broadband. And when you think about it, I don't know how many thousands of people work in the transportation department, but they're literally, when I started, it was me, was the only person working on broadband in the entire Commonwealth. So if we're saying that this is an important infrastructure asset, part of what we were trying to do was to build our own capacity to be able to do this, to do sort of the blocking and tackling of governance. So again, the notion here is that we were going to use this $40 million to invest in long-lived durable assets. Because we're using state bond funds, the state actually has to own it. And what's been really nice about this is that since the MBI was created, the Obama administration, through the Recovery Act, allocated $7.2 billion for broadband nationally, which is an extraordinary number for the public sector. And the $40 million has allowed us to leverage almost $80 million in additional federal funding for projects both in Western Mass and on the Cape. At the time the legislation was signed into law by the governor, 32 towns in Massachusetts were completely unserved. They had no broadband whatsoever, and another 63 were underserved with broadband access in only some areas of each community. So, next slide. Some of the issues, again, that what we're trying to do here, we're trying to complement private investment, not substitute for it. And we've already talked about these sort of national priorities or public goods that we're seeking to promote through this. Next slide. So some of the objectives that we are trying to do on this, and that diagram over there sort of shows you the service area of what's called Mass Broadband 123, which is named that way because it actually touches on 123 communities in Western Mass. We're building a open access middle mile fiber network. Do people know what I talk about when I refer to middle mile? So if you were to think about broadband, some people refer to like middle mile or last mile. Some of the broadband advocates sort of say, well, last mile, you really should be referring to it as first mile. That's the piece that actually connects to the home. So if you were to think about it like roads, the middle mile is like the interstate, and then the last mile is like the road off the interstate and the driveway to the house. So it's very expensive. What we're doing in Western Mass is going on 35,000 poles. There's significant cost attached to that, but the model around this is by having an open access, it permits companies like Verizon or anyone else to write it and reach their customers in ways that are much more cost effective for them. It's not our intention to be a broadband service provider. There are a lot of reasons that will be part of the decision tree for Verizon and others about deciding whether or not they want to do this, but I would argue that Verizon, because of its unique array of assets that are already in Western Mass, this might be something that would make it easier for them to reach some of these customers in a way that will allow Verizon to profit and prosper, and for the state to accrue a lot of the public benefits that come out of this. Fiber, you think about this is technology, is this going to be outdated really quickly? Fiber is actually something that's pretty durable and long-lived, and even if people migrate to wireless broadband networks in the next 10, 15, 20 years, they still need fiber to ride back to the point of presence, which is in Western Mass, Springfield, and then on to the internet. So I don't think that I need to go into much more detail on this, because I know that we're just trying to tap the surface on this, but I'm looking forward to hearing from Verizon and answering questions about this. And again, we can go into as much detail on Mass Broadband 123 and what we're specifically doing in Western Mass as you would like, but I think that we're trying to keep this at a higher level policy discussion. So, thank you.
Stand before.